Welcome back to Nocturnal Notions. If you're here for the first time, you've found a quiet place on the internet. And if you've been here before, you already know what to do. Get comfortable, dim whatever light is left, and if you enjoy tonight's journey, a like and a follow mean the world and help more restless minds find their way here. Tonight, we are leaving the present behind. Before history was written down, it was whispered. It was carved into bones, into stone, into the walls of temples where smoke rose toward gods that no longer have names. Picture a world without certainty, where the sky was not a backdrop but a message, where priests and priestesses stood at the edge of fire and said, "I have seen what comes next." And sometimes, what they said came true. This is not a program that asks you to believe in prophecy. It asks something smaller. That you wonder about it. That you let yourself sit inside the strangeness of human history, where the line between prediction and coincidence has never been perfectly clear. We have 50 stories tonight. 50 moments when someone looked into the unknown and said, "This is what will happen." And the world, in some form or another, answered. So settle in. Close your eyes if you like. Let your thoughts slow, and let the ancient voices do what they have always done, whisper across the distance. We will begin at the very edge of recorded time. It is the year 585 BCE. On the border between two empires, the Lydians in the west and the Medes in the east, two armies have been fighting for 5 years. 5 years of campaign seasons, of men marching across what is today the country of Turkey, bleeding into its soil. Neither side has won. Neither side will quit. And then the sun goes out. The Greek philosopher Thales of Miletus had, by some ancient accounts, predicted that a solar eclipse would occur in this particular year. We do not fully understand how. The mathematics of eclipse prediction requires knowledge that scholars still debate whether the ancient Greeks possessed. But the claim exists. It has persisted for over 2,000 years. On the 28th of May, 585 BCE, in the middle of a battle, the sky darkened. The sun disappeared in the middle of the day. Both armies stopped fighting. The historian Herodotus, writing roughly a century later, tells us that the Lydians and the Medes interpreted the eclipse as a divine sign, a message from the heavens that the war should end. They put down their weapons. They negotiated a peace. The river Halys became the border between their kingdoms, and the war was over. A peace sealed with a solar eclipse. A war ended not by strategy or surrender, but by the shadow of the moon passing across the face of the sun. Whether Thales truly predicted this eclipse is a matter of scholarly debate. Some historians believe he may have used Babylonian eclipse records, cycles of approximately 18 years that Mesopotamian astronomers had documented, to make a general forecast. Others believe the attribution is legend, added later to elevate his reputation. But the eclipse happened. The war ended. And for millennia, people have connected those two facts. Sometimes a shadow is just a shadow. And sometimes it changes everything. Assyria, a name that once made the ancient world tremble. An empire stretching from Persia to Egypt, from the mountains of Turkey to the shores of the Mediterranean. Its kings built palaces of impossible scale. Its armies moved with mechanical precision. For centuries, to be in Assyria's path meant destruction. And yet, within the vast clay libraries of Nineveh, scribes recorded a particular date with careful unease. In 763 BCE, Assyrian astronomical records note a solar eclipse. These records, among the oldest reliable astronomical observations in history, are dry, precise things. They note the eclipse in the same column as grain prices and military dispatches. But surrounding this particular eclipse, the records also describe revolt. social unrest. A city rising against its governor. In Mesopotamian astrology, solar eclipses were not neutral events. They were warnings. Specifically, they were warnings about the king. Ancient texts describe elaborate rituals designed to protect the monarch when an eclipse was predicted. Substitute kings were sometimes appointed, allowed to symbolically absorb whatever bad fortune the eclipse portended, before being quietly removed from power. The eclipse of 763 BCE was not predicted in advance, but it was recorded alongside instability, and later Assyrian scribes connected them. This practice of treating celestial events as warnings, as divine communications, would persist across Mesopotamia for centuries. It would influence the astrology of Greece, of Rome, of Persia. The idea that the sky speaks about kings, that when the sun falters, thrones tremble, is old. Older than writing, probably. Assyria itself would fall in 612 BCE, when the Babylonians and Medes combined to sack Nineveh. The clay tablets of its library, the ones containing these eclipse records, were buried under rubble and discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. The stars they watched are still up there, still moving in the same patterns. The name Pythagoras brings to mind right triangles, school mathematics, the clean relationship between the sides of a shape. But the historical Pythagoras and those who came after him believed something far stranger and more beautiful, that the universe itself was built on mathematics, and that if you understood the numbers, you could understand everything, including the future. Early Greek thinkers, influenced by Babylonian astronomy, began identifying cycles in celestial events. The Saros cycle, approximately 18 years and 11 days, describes the period after which eclipses repeat in similar patterns. The Metonic cycle, 19 years, describes when the phases of the moon return to the same days of the solar calendar. If you knew these cycles, you could predict eclipses, not through divine vision, but through arithmetic. Here is where ancient history becomes genuinely fascinating. To the Greeks of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, the difference between a mathematical prediction and a prophecy was not always clear. If a philosopher correctly predicted an eclipse using number patterns, was that science? Or was it a form of seeing? Was mathematics a tool for understanding the divine order of the cosmos, or was it simply calculation? Pythagoras and his followers believed the two were inseparable. Numbers were sacred. Ratios were holy. The harmony of celestial spheres, planets moving in perfect mathematical relationships, was not a metaphor. It was theology. This blurred line between calculation and prophecy, between astronomy and astrology, would remain smudged for 2,000 years. Even Kepler, in the 17th century, cast horoscopes alongside calculating planetary orbits. The mathematics of the heavens. It was always both things at once. Croesus, king of Lydia in the 6th century BCE, was legendarily wealthy. His name became a proverb, rich as Croesus, that persists to this day. He ruled a prosperous kingdom in western Anatolia and was considering a war against the growing Persian Empire. But first, he wanted to know if the gods were on his side. Rather than simply consulting an oracle and trusting it, Croesus did something shrewd and almost scientific. He sent messengers to 7 of the most famous oracles in the ancient world. Each messenger was given the same instruction. On a specific day, at a specific hour, go to the oracle and ask, "What is the king of Lydia doing right now?" Croesus, on that day and at that hour, performed a deliberately strange act. He took a tortoise and a lamb, placed them together in a bronze pot, and boiled them. Not a typical royal activity. The kind of thing that would be essentially impossible to guess. Most oracles, according to Herodotus, gave vague or useless answers. Some simply failed. But one oracle, Delphi, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus in Greece, is said to have responded in verse. The response described, with remarkable specificity, the boiling of a tortoise and a lamb together in a bronze cauldron. Croesus was astonished. He considered the test passed. He sent Delphi extraordinary gifts, gold, silver, amber, and more, and established a lasting relationship with the oracle. Herodotus wrote this story over a century after the events. There was ample time for embellishment. The story may be entirely legendary. It may be a narrative invented to explain Delphi's famous reputation. But the test itself is interesting. Croesus tried to apply something like empirical verification to prophecy. He did not simply believe. He designed an experiment. The ancient world could be surprisingly skeptical. The Delphic response to Croesus, as preserved by Herodotus, arrived in hexameter verse, the formal meter of divine communication in ancient Greece. It said, roughly, I can count the grains of sand and measure the sea. I understand the mute and hear the voiceless. The smell reaches me of a hard-shelled tortoise, boiling in bronze with the flesh of a lamb, bronze below it, bronze above. The oracle of Delphi sat at the center of the ancient Greek world, literally. Greeks called Delphi the omphalos, the navel of the world. A stone marked the spot. The oracle was a woman, known as the Pythia, who breathed vapors rising from a crack in the earth and entered a trance state. Priests interpreted her utterances, translating them into formal verse. For centuries, Greek city-states, kings, and private citizens traveled to Delphi with their questions. Wars were launched or cancelled on her advice. Colonies were founded where she pointed. Laws were made in her name. Modern geology has found that the site of Delphi sits above a geological fault where ethylene gas, a sweet-smelling compound with mild hallucinogenic properties, could seep from the earth. This may explain the trance states. The interpretations, the translations of utterance into verse, were performed by educated priest-poets who understood politics, history, and human psychology. Their answers were frequently ambiguous, constructed so they could be read multiple ways. But sometimes, like the boiled lamb and tortoise, they were not ambiguous at all. Confident in Delphi's accuracy, Croesus returned with his most important question: if I attack the Persian Empire, will I win? Delphi answered, if Croesus crosses the river Halys and attacks Persia, a great empire will be destroyed. Croesus heard what he wanted to hear. A great empire destroyed. He was attacking a great empire. So naturally, the empire that would be destroyed was Persia. He crossed the river Halys. Cyrus the Great of Persia met him in battle. The fighting was inconclusive. Croesus withdrew, intending to resume the campaign in spring. But Cyrus followed him. He attacked Lydian cavalry with camels. Horses, unfamiliar with camels, panicked and broke ranks. The Lydian army collapsed. Croesus was captured. The great empire that was destroyed was Lydia. This story has been told for 2.5 millennia as the definitive example of why oracle prophecies cannot be trusted, or alternatively, as proof of their eerie accuracy. Delphi told the literal truth. A great empire was destroyed. It simply was not the one Croesus assumed. The oracle did not lie. The listener misread. And perhaps that is always how prophecy works. Not as a map, but as a mirror. Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, was one of the most gifted military and political strategists of the ancient world. He transformed Macedonia from a peripheral kingdom into the dominant power in Greece through a combination of military innovation, diplomacy, and extraordinary ruthlessness. He was also deeply attentive to oracles. When Philip was planning his campaigns and needed funding, he consulted Delphi. The oracle's response included an image of silver spears, a metaphor that Philip interpreted as guidance toward a source of silver. Philip identified silver mines in the region of Mount Pangaean in Thrace. He captured the area, reorganized and expanded the mines, and used the income to fund his armies. With that silver, he modernized and enlarged his forces, developed the legendary Macedonian phalanx, and began the systematic conquest of Greece. The silver mines of Pangaean effectively paid for the unification of the Greek world under Macedonian rule and laid the financial foundation for Alexander's later conquests of Persia and beyond. Whether the oracle literally pointed Philip toward mines or whether he simply found an oracle that confirmed what he already intended, we cannot know. What we can observe is that the connection between religious authority and political action was real and functional in the ancient world. Kings did not simply use oracles as cover for decisions already made. They genuinely believed. And genuine belief changes how decisively you act. When Alexander the Great arrived at Delphi to consult the oracle before his Persian campaign, the Pythia was not available. It was a day when consultations were not performed, an inauspicious time. Alexander, who did not accept closed doors, reportedly dragged the Pythia physically toward the sanctuary. She is said to have exclaimed, in exasperation, "Young man, you are invincible." Alexander immediately declared this her official pronouncement and left, satisfied. He had received what he came for. Whether this story is literally true or is itself a legend grown around Alexander's personality, his absolute certainty of divine favor is impossible to verify. But it captures something real about the man. Alexander had been raised to believe he was special in a way that transcended ordinary human ambition. His mother Olympias claimed divine paternity. He modeled himself on Achilles, carrying a copy of the Iliad with him on campaign, annotated by his tutor Aristotle. From an early age, he understood his life in terms of myth and destiny. This belief, this absolute, unshakable conviction that the universe was arranged in his favor, may itself explain much of his success. He took risks that rational commanders would not. He charged into situations that common sense would call suicidal. And he survived, repeatedly, until he didn't. At the age of 32, he was dead. And the world he built lasted barely a generation after him. In 331 BCE, with Egypt already under his control, Alexander made a decision that puzzled his generals. He turned away from the efficient path of conquest and led his army on an arduous march across the Libyan desert, hundreds of miles of sand and thirst, to visit a remote oracle at the oasis of Tyre. The Oracle of Amun. An oracle that the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Persians all respected. Alexander entered the inner sanctuary of the temple alone. No one else was permitted. Whatever the oracle said to him, whatever the priests of Amun communicated, he never fully disclosed it. When he emerged, his companions reported that he seemed changed. Luminous. Certain. He confirmed only one thing, that he had received the answer he desired. What spread through the army and eventually throughout the Greek world was this: the oracle of Amun had declared Alexander to be the son of the god. Not metaphorically. Literally. In Egyptian tradition, pharaohs were considered divine sons of Amun. By consulting this oracle, Alexander was claiming the mantle of Egyptian kingship and suggesting that his parentage was not entirely human. For the rest of his campaigns, Alexander increasingly emphasized divine elements of his identity. He demanded proskynesis, the act of prostration before a god or king, from his followers. He founded cities named Alexandria. He moved through the ancient world not merely as a conqueror but as something that had never existed before, a living god-king who was also a Macedonian general. The desert still knows what the oracle said. It has not told anyone else. The year 480 BCE. Persia, under King Xerxes, is coming. The scale of the invasion is staggering. Ancient sources claim millions of soldiers, which is certainly an exaggeration, but even historians who drastically discount the numbers agree it was the largest army the ancient Mediterranean world had seen. Athens is directly in its path. Athens sent representatives to Delphi, desperate for guidance. The first response was so dire that the messengers could barely bring themselves to report it. It essentially described the fall of Athens and the destruction of everything. The Athenians begged for another consultation. The oracle returned a second answer, still ominous, but containing a phrase that would become one of the most debated interpretations in history: a wooden wall would save them. What was the wooden wall? Some Athenians believed it referred to the ancient wooden palisade around the Acropolis. They argued that Athens should make it stand there, defending the sacred hill. But a politician and general named Themistocles offered a different interpretation. The wooden wall, he said, was the fleet. Athens had recently discovered a massive vein of silver at the mines of Laurion. Themistocles had argued for using that silver not to distribute as a bonus to citizens but to build warships. 200 triremes. The wooden wall was ships. Athens evacuated. The city was abandoned. Women and children were sent to nearby islands. And the fleet was positioned to fight. The Acropolis was burned by the Persians. And the fleet won. The Battle of Salamis took place in September of 480 BCE, in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast. Themistocles had maneuvered the Persian fleet into fighting there deliberately. In confined waters, the Greek triremes' maneuverability would offset Persian numbers. The Persian fleet was destroyed. Over 200 Persian ships were sunk or captured. Xerxes watched the battle from a golden throne on a hilltop above the strait. He retreated. The invasion was effectively over. Greece, its city-states, its politics, its philosophy, its nascent democracy, survived. In the years after Salamis, the oracle's words were widely understood as having described exactly what happened. A wooden wall, the fleet, had saved Greece. The prophecy had been accurate. Themistocles had read it correctly. Whether the oracle had actually foreseen the future or whether a clever politician had found the interpretation that suited his preferred strategy and then watched history validate it, cannot be untangled. Both things can be true at the same time. What remains genuinely remarkable is the chain of events. Silver discovered in a mine. An unusual decision to build ships instead of spending the silver. An oracle's ambiguous words interpreted as endorsement. An evacuation of an entire city. A naval battle in a narrow strait. And Greek civilization, with its particular gifts to the world, continuing. The oracle may not have seen it. But someone did. Sparta was different. Every visitor to ancient Greece recognized this. The city had no walls. The Spartans famously said their men were their walls. It had a dual kingship, 2 kings simultaneously, which was unique in the Greek world. Its society was organized entirely around military excellence. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 to begin military training that would last until age 30. A lawgiver named Lycurgus, and behind Lycurgus, Delphi. Spartan tradition held that the entire framework of Spartan society, the dual kings, the council of elders, the assembly of citizens, the communal military training, had been delivered to Lycurgus by the oracle at Delphi. He had traveled there, received divine instructions, and returned to implement them. The Delphic response to Lycurgus reportedly called him something extraordinary, not quite a man and not quite a god. It told him the laws he would establish would be finer than any others. Whether any of this is historically accurate is doubtful. Lycurgus may be a mythical figure. The reforms attributed to him probably occurred over centuries. But Sparta preserved the origin story because it served a crucial function. It gave the system divine authorization. You did not question the dual kingship or the communal training because it had not been invented by politicians. It had been revealed by a god. For roughly 3 centuries, Sparta was the dominant military power in Greece. Its system, however unusual, worked. And it attributed its success not to itself but to oracular wisdom. Belief in divine origin is a powerful stabilizer. It makes institutions feel inevitable. Rome and Delphi had a complicated relationship. Early Roman tradition, much of it legendary by the time it was written down, preserved stories of Roman leaders consulting the oracle at moments of crisis or decision. One of these traditions, preserved in later sources, claimed that Delphi had once prophesied that a small settlement on the banks of a river in Italy, not yet called Rome, would one day rule the world. This story has the unmistakable smell of retrospective invention. Prophesies that name small, insignificant places as future world powers are almost always composed after the world power has been established. They are a way of giving destiny the shape of inevitability. But if you were a citizen of the Roman Republic in the 3rd century BCE, watching your city fight for its life against Carthage, or in the 2nd century BC, systematically absorbing the Hellenistic kingdoms, you might have found genuine comfort in the idea that all of this had been foreseen. That there was a pattern. That Rome's rise was not accidental. Prophecy as meaning-making. Prophecy as national narrative. Almost every civilization that has achieved greatness has retrospectively discovered that it was always going to. The stars, they decide, were always pointing here. Not all Roman prophecy came from Delphi. Rome had its own prophetic tradition, the Sibylline books. According to legend, a woman known as the Cumaean Sibyl, an ancient prophetess at Cumae, near Naples, once approached the early Roman king Tarquin the Proud with an offer. She had 9 books of prophecy. He could buy them all for a price. Tarquin refused. Too expensive. The Sibyl burned 3 of the books and returned, offering the remaining 6 at the original price for 9. He refused again. She burned 3 more. Returned with 3, asking the same price. Tarquin finally consulted his augurs, who told him in alarm to buy the remaining books immediately. The Sibylline books, locked in a stone vault beneath the Capitoline Hill, guarded by a special college of priests, were consulted only in moments of national crisis, when the Senate voted to permit it. They reportedly contained prophecies about Rome's fate, its moments of greatness, its vulnerabilities, its eventual decline. Including, according to later tradition, a vision of destruction by fire. In 64 CE, Rome burned. The Emperor Nero watched it. The fire destroyed vast sections of the city. And afterward, those who remembered the Sibylline warning said, it was foretold. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was simply that fire, in a city built mostly of wood, was always inevitable. The Sibylline books themselves were eventually destroyed, in a different fire, in 83 BCE. Only fragments and references survive. Enough to suggest what they contained. Not enough to be sure. In 218 BC, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca did something that his enemies considered impossible. He gathered his army, including 37 war elephants, in Spain, marched through southern France, and crossed the Alps into Italy. The pass is disputed by historians. It was probably the Col de la Traversette, at roughly 3,000 meters altitude, in October. Men and elephants died in the cold and on the ice. The path was not wide enough. Sections of cliff had to be broken away. Snow fell. He arrived in northern Italy with perhaps half the men he started with. And then he started winning. Roman tradition held that the Sibylline books, when consulted in the Second Punic War, had contained warnings about a terrible enemy crossing mountains from the north. About catastrophic losses. About the near destruction of Rome. Hannibal remained in Italy for 15 years. He won 3 catastrophic victories against Roman armies, the Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, where between 50 and 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. Rome faced extinction. And survived. Barely. Did the Sibylline books genuinely predict Hannibal? Or did Romans, in the horror of the Punic Wars, reach for their sacred texts to make sense of unimaginable catastrophe and find, in the ambiguous language of prophecy, what they needed to find? Humans are pattern-finding creatures. We find patterns even in randomness. And when the pattern matches, it feels like more than coincidence. It might be. It might not be. Both possibilities are allowed to be strange. Around 40 BCE, the Roman poet Virgil wrote his fourth eclogue, a pastoral poem that departs dramatically from the bucolic tone of the others. In it, he describes the imminent arrival of a new golden age. A divine child will be born. A great cycle of time will renew. Under this child's rule, the earth will produce abundantly without labor. Lions will pose no threat to cattle. Serpents will disappear. And the old heroic age, the age of gods walking among men, will return. This was written in a period of terrible civil war. Julius Caesar had been murdered. Mark Antony and Octavian, the future Augustus, were competing for dominance. Italy had been devastated by the violence of competing armies. Poets wrote of longing for peace as something almost supernatural in its desirability. Within Virgil's lifetime, the child would be associated with Augustus, the first Roman emperor, whose reign was famously called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Augustus used Virgilian imagery extensively in his self-presentation. The Golden Age had arrived. The divine child was grown. Rome was renewed. Later, in the Christian Middle Ages, Virgil's fourth eclogue would be read as a prophecy of the birth of Christ, a pagan poet unknowingly foretelling the Messiah. Dante would make Virgil his guide through hell and purgatory partly for this reason. The pagan who had seen what he could not have understood. No one knows for certain who Virgil intended as the child. He may have meant a diplomatic baby expected from a political alliance that never produced one. He may have written in a deliberately universal mode, the child as an archetype rather than a specific person. Or perhaps he simply wrote something true, and history kept finding people to fill the role. Josephus was a Jewish general and historian who lived in the 1st century CE. When the Jewish revolt against Rome began in 66 CE, he was appointed a military commander. He was eventually captured by the Romans after the fall of a fortress called Jotapata, where he had apparently survived a mass suicide pact by strategic positioning. Brought before the Roman general Vespasian, Josephus did not cringe or beg for mercy. Instead, he made a prediction. He told Vespasian that he would become emperor of Rome. This was not obviously true at the time. The Emperor Nero was alive. Vespasian was a competent but not especially distinguished general, sent to handle a provincial rebellion at the edge of the empire. There was no obvious reason to think he was about to become emperor. Nero died in 68 CE. In the chaos that followed, the year of the 4 emperors, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor by the legions of the East in 69 CE and marched on Rome. He founded the Flavian dynasty. Josephus was released. He lived under Roman patronage, took the family name Flavius in honor of his patrons, and wrote the histories, the Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities, that remain our primary sources for this period of history. Did Josephus have genuine prophetic insight? Did he simply read the political winds more accurately than most? Did he invent the prediction after the fact, in his own memoir? We rely on Josephus himself for the account. He is not a neutral witness to his own life. But the story has a shape that feels true, whether or not it is literally accurate. The prisoner who survives by predicting the future of his captor. The historian who becomes part of history. In the late 19th century, Chinese scholars began noticing unusual objects for sale in traditional medicine markets, fragments of bone and turtle shell with strange markings. The markings turned out to be writing. The oldest writing ever found in China. They came from the tombs and ritual sites of the Shang dynasty, roughly 1600 to 1046 BC, a civilization that had left almost no traces in later Chinese historical memory until archaeology began recovering it. The oracle bones were tools of divination. When the Shang kings, who were also high priests, the intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world, faced a decision, they would consult their ancestors. A diviner would apply heat to a bone or turtle shell until it cracked. The pattern of cracks was then interpreted as an answer. And then, and this is what makes the oracle bones extraordinary as historical artifacts, the diviners sometimes wrote the question on the bone. And sometimes wrote the king's prediction. And sometimes, later, wrote what actually happened. Questions range from the cosmic to the mundane. Will we win this battle? Will the harvest be good? Will the queen give birth to a son? Is it safe to travel this week? Should we make this sacrifice? Some of the recorded outcomes match the predictions. Some do not. The diviners seem to have tracked their accuracy, perhaps as a form of quality control, perhaps out of sincere interest in understanding the connection between crack patterns and future events. These are private documents from a civilization that thought divination was as normal as weather forecasting. The bones record the anxiety of a king before a battle, the hope of a family awaiting a birth, the careful management of a state through the consultation of unseen powers. They were buried for 3,000 years. We read them now. Among the oracle bones from the later period of the Shang dynasty, the reign of the last Shang king, Di Xin, who would become a byword for tyranny in Chinese historical tradition, there are inscriptions that scholars find particularly haunting. The questions asked of ancestors and spirits shift in tone. Where earlier oracle bones often have a confident, administrative character, managing the business of a functioning state, later ones carry something that reads, across 3,000 years, like unease. There are questions about enemies to the West, the Jew people, who were growing in power and influence. There are records of military campaigns that seem to go poorly. There are sacrificial records of increasing scale, as if the king was trying to appease forces that refused to be appeased. Around 1046 BCE, the Jew launched a final campaign against Shang. The Shang armies, according to tradition, defected or surrendered en masse. Di Xin reportedly set his palace on fire and died in the flames. The Jew took care to frame their conquest as divinely mandated. They introduced the concept of the mandate of heaven, which would govern Chinese political philosophy for millennia. A dynasty that ruled well retained heaven's mandate. One that became corrupt and cruel lost it. The Shang, the Jew argued, had lost theirs. Did the Shang diviners sense, in their cracking bones and spirit consultations, that the end was coming? The oracle records do not directly say so. But the accumulation of anxious questions, the escalating rituals, the records of repeated campaigns and instability, read in sequence, they feel like the records of a court that knew, on some level, that something was wrong. Sometimes prophecy is not a statement about the future. It is a recognition of the present. Among the oldest texts in human civilization are a genre that modern scholars call lament compositions, lengthy, formal poems describing the destruction of great cities. The lament for the destruction of Ur. The lament for the destruction of Sumer and Ur. The lament for Nippur. These texts, some dating to approximately 2000 BC, describe specific cities, their temples, their patron gods, their populations being destroyed and abandoned. They are written in the voice of the city's goddess, weeping over her ruined home. Here is what makes these texts strange. Some of them appear to have been written to describe a destruction that had not yet occurred, a destruction foretold by the gods, which the city's people had been warned about and could not prevent. The goddess of Ur, in the lament text, is told by the great gods that Ur will fall. She pleads. She is told the decision is final. She weeps the city's destruction in advance, as prophecy, before it becomes history. The city of Ur did fall. Multiple times across Mesopotamian history. The lament texts were later read as having accurately described what happened, as prophetic testimony of divine decision. Lament texts served multiple purposes simultaneously. They were religious rituals for mourning destroyed sacred spaces. They were political documents, sometimes composed by successor powers to legitimize the transfer of divine favor. They were warnings. This is what happens when the gods withdraw their protection. And read now, by archaeologists who excavated the actual ruins of Ur, who dug through the layers of destruction and found the evidence of exactly what the text described, they feel like something even more precise. Records of a world that knew it was ending. Jeremiah was active in Jerusalem from approximately 627 BCE through the Babylonian conquest of 587 BCE, one of the most catastrophic periods in Israelite history. He watched his city struggle with impossible choices: submit to Babylon or resist with Egyptian support. He was deeply unpopular for most of his career because he kept saying the same thing: resistance is futile. Babylon will win. Do not trust Egypt. In the book of Jeremiah, there are detailed pronouncements against Egypt, against the power of Pharaoh Necho, against the Egyptian armies, against the arrogance of the Nile Delta. Jeremiah declares that Babylon will come and defeat Egypt, that the Pharaoh will be humiliated, that Egypt's military power will fail. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon defeated the Egyptian army at the Battle of Carchemish, a crushing defeat that effectively ended Egypt's military presence in the Levant. Later Babylonian campaigns into Egypt itself, while less decisive, repeatedly demonstrated that Egypt could not match Babylonian power in the region. Jeremiah's fundamental strategic assessment, that Egypt was an unreliable ally and that Babylonian power was overwhelming, was correct. Was Jeremiah a genuine prophet? A sharp political analyst who read the balance of power accurately and expressed his conclusions in religious language? Both simultaneously? In the ancient world, these categories overlapped. The most effective prophets were often the most realistic observers of political reality, people who could see what was actually happening, stripped of wishful thinking, and who expressed it in terms their society understood as divine communication. Sometimes seeing clearly is its own kind of miracle. The prophet Ezekiel, writing from Babylon in the 6th century BCE, delivers an extended and remarkably specific prophecy against the city of Tyre, a great Phoenician trading city on the eastern Mediterranean coast that had refused to mourn Jerusalem's fall and had instead reportedly celebrated. Ezekiel declares, Many nations will come against Tyre. Its stones and timber and soil will be thrown into the sea. It will become a bare rock, a place for the spreading of fishing nets. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon besieged Tyre for 13 years, 586 to 573 BCE. The mainland portion of the city was eventually taken and destroyed. But Tyre was also an island, separated from the shore by a narrow channel of water. The island portion held out. Nebuchadnezzar withdrew. The prophecy, as written, had not quite been fulfilled. The island Tyre remained. 240 years later, Alexander the Great besieged Tyre. The island, as before, presented the problem: how do you take an island city without a navy? Alexander's solution was extraordinary. He built a causeway, a solid road across the water, connecting the mainland to the island. To build it, his engineers used the rubble of the destroyed mainland city, the stones, the timber, the very soil of old Tyre, and threw them into the sea. Exactly as Ezekiel had said. Whether Ezekiel foresaw Alexander is impossible to know. Whether the language about throwing stones and timber into the sea described Nebuchadnezzar's destruction rather than Alexander's causeway and was only later connected to Alexander, possible. Whether the match between prophecy and historical event is genuinely strange. The causeway still exists. It is now a peninsula, built up over centuries by accumulated sediment. The modern city of Tyre sits on it. Belshazzar, king of Babylon, is hosting a great feast. The year is approximately 539 BCE. He orders that the sacred vessels from the destroyed Jerusalem temple, objects captured by Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier, be brought out and used as drinking vessels. His nobles and their wives drink from them. And then, according to the book of Daniel, a hand appears. A disembodied hand, writing on the wall. Min, tekel, upharsin. Aramaic words, units of weight, and a verb. Numbered, weighed, divided. Daniel, summoned to interpret them, reads them as a judgment. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That same night, according to Daniel, Belshazzar is killed. Darius the Mede takes the kingdom. Babylon did fall in 539 BC to Cyrus the Great of Persia, not to a figure named Darius the Mede, which creates historical complications that scholars still debate. The fall of Babylon was remarkably peaceful by ancient standards. Cyrus entered the city and was reportedly welcomed by the population and by the priests of the Babylonian god Marduk. Whether there was a feast, a hand, written words, these belong to a story that cannot be verified from outside the text. But the phrase has lasted. Writing on the wall, a warning that arrives too late, from a source that cannot be argued with, remains in the language. 26 centuries later, we still use it. In the book of Daniel, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a great statue made of 4 different materials: a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Daniel interprets this as a prophecy of 4 successive world empires. The statue is struck by a stone and collapses, and the stone becomes a great mountain that fills the earth. Jewish and Christian interpreters from antiquity through the medieval period mapped these 4 empires onto Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. The stone that destroys the statue and fills the earth was identified as the kingdom of God, a divine reality that would ultimately supersede all human empires. Most biblical scholars today believe the book of Daniel was composed in its final form during the 2nd century BCE, during the period of the Seleucid Empire's persecution of Jewish practice under Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The 4 empires in this reading are the same 4, but the prophecy was composed after the first 3 had already occurred and was thus more history than prediction. What is remarkable is that the schema still works. The sequence of Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome is accurate as a description of Near Eastern hegemonic power in the 1st millennium BCE. And the image of history as a succession of kingdoms, each succeeding the last, each made of progressively cheaper material, gold giving way to iron mixed with clay, resonates as a description of how civilizations feel about their own moment. We usually believe we live in the clay and iron era. Every era does. In the 40th chapter of the book of Isaiah, a passage of extraordinary comfort begins. "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God." But it is what comes about a dozen chapters later that stops readers cold. Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28, "He is my shepherd, and he shall carry out all my purpose." And Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue nations before him." Cyrus. The text names Cyrus. Specifically, Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, who would conquer Babylon and liberate the Jewish exiles. Traditionally dated materials for the prophet Isaiah active in the reign of King Hezekiah, approximately 740 to 700 BCE. Cyrus the Great was born around 600 BCE. He conquered Babylon in 539 BCE. If the dating is accurate, Isaiah named a specific foreign king by name over a century before he was born. Most biblical scholars today argue that the second half of Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55, was composed by a different author writing during or near the Babylonian exile, perhaps around 550 to 540 BCE, when Cyrus was already a known and rising power. In this view, the naming of Cyrus is impressively accurate political analysis, not supernatural foreknowledge. Conservative religious scholars maintain the traditional view that Isaiah himself, writing over a century earlier, named Cyrus through genuine divine prophecy. Cyrus himself, when he conquered Babylon, issued a famous cylinder decree in which he claimed that the Babylonian god Marduk had called him by name to restore proper worship in the city. 2 religious traditions, Jewish and Babylonian, told stories in which Cyrus had been named and chosen by their god before events unfolded. Whatever the explanation, Cyrus the Great entered history already surrounded by the language of destiny. Multiple prophetic texts in the Hebrew Bible describe a scenario in which the great Euphrates River, the lifeblood of Babylon, the source of its fertility and its natural defense, is dried up, allowing invaders to enter the city. The ancient sources, Herodotus and Xenophon, describe the Persian conquest of Babylon under Cyrus as involving a clever hydraulic maneuver. Cyrus diverted the Euphrates River at a point where it ran beneath the walls of Babylon. With the water level reduced, Persian soldiers were able to walk beneath the walls through the riverbed and enter the city. The great river was, in a sense, dried, or at least lowered sufficiently to allow passage. Whether the prophetic texts describe this specific technique or whether they use dried rivers as a general image of divine power, the kind of thing God was imagined to do, as at the Red Sea or the Jordan, cannot be determined from the texts alone. Prophetic language typically operates in images that resonate symbolically as well as potentially literally. But the convergence remains interesting. A specific image, the river entering or ceasing, and a specific historical event involving exactly that. Babylon, after its conquest by Cyrus, was not destroyed. It remained a great city for centuries. Alexander the Great died there. It began its long decline only gradually, as trade routes shifted and the irrigation systems fell into disrepair and the desert slowly moved in. The Euphrates still flows, though not quite where it did. In 597 and 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon deported significant portions of the Judean population to Babylon, the event known as the Babylonian exile. The Jerusalem temple was destroyed. The Davidic monarchy ended. A community of perhaps tens of thousands of Judeans found themselves living in an alien empire. During the exile, prophetic voices, including Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the author or authors of later Isaiah, repeatedly promised that the exile would end, that God had not abandoned the people, that they would return to their land. Jeremiah notably specified a time frame, 70 years. After 70 years, Babylon's power would end and the people would return. Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BCE and immediately issued what became known as the Edict of Cyrus, a policy of allowing deported peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The Jewish exiles were permitted, encouraged, to return to Judah and rebuild the Jerusalem temple. The Babylonian exile, from its beginning in 597 to the Edict of Cyrus in 539, was approximately 58 years. From 587, the year of the major deportation, to 539 is 48 years. The 70-year figure is rounded, or measured from a different starting point, or refers to the period before the temple was rebuilt. The return from exile is one of the central events in the shaping of Judaism as a religion. The experience of exile and return, of identity maintained under pressure, of promise remembered and eventually fulfilled, became foundational. And the prophesies that promised return before return happened, those texts survived because they were proven right, or at least right enough. The ones that were not proven right were less carefully preserved. In the 5th chapter of the book of Micah, a prophet active in the 8th century BCE, a small, almost overlooked town is mentioned, Bethlehem Ephrathah. Too small to be among the clans of Judah. And yet from it, Micah says, shall come forth one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. The Gospel of Matthew, telling the story of Jesus' birth, quotes this passage directly. When the Magi arrive asking where the King of the Jews has been born, the chief priests and scribes point to Micah's prophecy, Bethlehem of Judea. Bethlehem was David's city. David, the greatest king in Israelite tradition, had been born there. Micah's reference may originally have been an idealized hope for a restoration of Davidic kingship, a new David, from David's hometown, rather than a prediction of a specific individual centuries in the future. Whether Jesus was literally born in Bethlehem is also a matter of historical discussion. The census that Luke's Gospel uses to explain why Joseph and Mary traveled there is not corroborated in Roman records and is generally considered historically problematic by scholars. What is striking about Micah's passage, regardless of historical questions, is its tone. Too small to be among the clans. The great thing will come from the small place. The overlooked corner of the world will produce the one who matters. This is a deeply human idea. That greatness comes from unexpected places. That significance hides in what appears insignificant. Whether Bethlehem was prophecy or symbol or both simultaneously, the thought endures. In the 11th chapter of the book of Zechariah, a prophet writing in the late 6th or early 5th century BCE, there is a strange, allegorical passage involving a shepherd, a flock, and wages. The shepherd is paid 30 pieces of silver, described as the price at which I was valued by them, and told to throw it to the potter. The Gospel of Matthew identifies this passage as the prophecy fulfilled by Judas Iscariot's betrayal of Jesus. Judas receives 30 pieces of silver from the chief priests as payment for handing Jesus over. When he later regrets his action and returns the money, the priests use it to buy a potter's field, a field for burying strangers. 30 pieces of silver, in the context of Exodus, was the legal compensation for a slave killed by an animal, specifically an ox. It was not a large sum. It was the price of an ordinary life. If Matthew's account intends to echo Zechariah, the theological point is precise. The one betrayed was valued at the price of a slave. The 30 pieces of silver are not just money. They are a theological statement about how little the betrayed one was considered worth. 30 pieces of silver. Like writing on the wall, it has become a cultural shorthand for betrayal, for the price of conscience, for the moment when someone exchanges something precious for something cheap. Ancient language, still doing its work. In the book of Genesis, Rebekah is pregnant with twins. She feels them struggling in her womb and asks why. The divine answer she receives is, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the elder shall serve the younger. The twins are Esau and Jacob. Esau, the elder, who sells his birthright for a bowl of stew. Jacob, the younger, who disguises himself as Esau to receive the dying Isaac's blessing. In the ancient Near East, and across most ancient cultures, primogeniture was the rule. The eldest son inherited. The eldest son led. The eldest son was what the family's future depended on. The Genesis narratives repeatedly and deliberately violate this expectation. Abel over Cain. Isaac over Ishmael. Jacob over Esau. Joseph, the second youngest, over all his brothers. A pattern of chosen younger sons runs through the entire tradition. Esau is associated in the text with Edom, a neighboring people to the east of Israel. Jacob is Israel. The prophecy of the elder serving the younger was understood as describing the historical relationship between these two peoples, and during the period of David and Solomon's kingdom, Edom was indeed subordinate to Israel. Younger son narratives are a worldwide storytelling pattern, appearing in folklore from China to West Africa to medieval Europe. There is something universally resonant in the idea that the overlooked one is actually the chosen one. That second place can mean more than first. The prophecy is also a story about how humanity keeps insisting that the conventional hierarchy is not the final word. One of the most structurally consistent prophetic themes across the Hebrew Bible is a 3-part sequence: sin, punishment through exile or catastrophe, and eventual restoration. This pattern appears in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, the historical books, and across virtually every major prophetic text. After the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and especially after the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE, after which Jews were expelled from Judea entirely, the Jewish people were dispersed across the Mediterranean world and beyond. The pattern became historical reality on a vast scale. The ancient prophetic promises of return, of exile ending, of scattered people gathering back to their land, became the organizing hope of diaspora Judaism for nearly 2,000 years. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the subsequent immigration of Jewish communities from across the world was interpreted by many, especially in religious Zionist traditions, as the fulfillment of ancient prophetic promises. The prophecies of Ezekiel about dry bones coming to life, of Isaiah about a second Exodus, of Amos about restoring the fallen house of David. Whether one views 1948 as a geopolitical event, a humanitarian response to catastrophe, or the fulfillment of millennia-old prophecy, or all three simultaneously, depends on framework, not facts. What is undeniable is that a prophetic tradition preserved in text through 2.5 millennia became, for many people in the 20th century, lived experience. The words written in Babylon in the 6th century BCE were read in the 20th century as describing what was happening. The distance between the writing and the reading spans the entire history of Western civilization. Before Judaism, before Christianity, before Islam, there was a religious tradition that emerged on the Iranian plateau and shaped all three of them in ways that are still debated. Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zarathustra, is perhaps 6,000 years old in its early forms, though most scholars date its classical formulation to somewhere between 1500 and 600 BCE. It was the state religion of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the empire of Cyrus, of Darius, of Xerxes. It influenced the monotheism of the Jewish exiles in Babylon. Its concepts of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, of a final judgment, of a savior figure, and of a bodily resurrection all appear in later Abrahamic traditions. Central to Zoroastrian eschatology, its understanding of how history ends, is the figure of the Saoshyant, a future savior, born of a virgin from the preserved seed of Zarathustra himself, who will renew the world. Under the Saoshyant, the dead will be resurrected. Evil will be definitively defeated. The world will be made perfect. The parallels to messianic figures in other traditions are striking and have been noted for centuries. A future savior, virgin birth, resurrection of the dead, renewal of the world, the cosmic defeat of evil. Whether these concepts flowed from Zoroastrianism into other traditions, or whether they represent parallel development of universal human intuitions about how the story should end, scholars still debate. Zoroastrianism still exists. Approximately 100,000 to 200,000 Zoroastrians live today, primarily in India and Iran. They still await the Saoshyant. The prophecy is still active. The waiting continues. Hindu tradition understands time not as a straight line but as a vast cycle, the Mahayuga, or Great Age, consisting of 4 yugas or epochs. The Satya Yuga or Golden Age, when humanity lives in perfect righteousness and the natural world is abundant. The Treta Yuga, when virtue declines by a quarter. The Dvapara Yuga, where virtue is half what it was. And finally the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, the age of strife, discord, and spiritual decline. The Kali Yuga, according to various Hindu textual traditions, began approximately 3102 BCE, shortly after the death of Krishna, and will last 432,000 years. It is characterized by a progressive decline in human virtue and lifespan. People become shorter, meaner, more materialistic. Kings stop protecting the people. Merchants become more powerful than priests or warriors. Knowledge becomes transactional. The sacred is forgotten. Commentators across the centuries have identified signs of the Kali Yuga in their own era. This is, of course, a feature of the prophecy's design, a description sufficiently broad and timeless that every age can see itself in it. Industrial capitalism, nuclear weapons, ecological destruction, political corruption, the decline of traditional values, all have been cited as proof that we are deep in the Kali Yuga. The Kali Yuga does not end in destruction but in renewal. The god Kalki will appear, riding a white horse, to destroy falsehood and begin the Satya Yuga anew. The great wheel of time will continue turning. A prophecy of decline that is also, in its structure, a prophecy of return. The darkness as part of a cycle that includes light. The wheel keeps turning. It has always kept turning. Among the texts recovered from Hellenistic Egypt is a document known as the Oracle of the Potter, a prophecy composed, in its surviving form, sometime between the 2nd century BCE and the 3rd century CE, though possibly preserving older traditions. It is framed as the prophecy of a divine potter who smashes his wheel and speaks of Egypt's future. The oracle predicts a period of chaos and foreign domination for Egypt. The Nile will fail to flood properly, catastrophic for an agricultural civilization entirely dependent on the annual inundation. Foreign rulers will bring drought, pestilence, and misery. But eventually, a king from the sun god will come and restore Egypt. The foreigners will be expelled. Memphis will be restored as the sacred center. Joy will return. Egypt under Ptolemaic rule and then under Roman rule experienced exactly the kinds of disruptions the oracle describes. Periods of poor Nile flooding, social unrest, tax burdens, foreign administrators who did not understand or respect Egyptian traditions. The Oracle of the Potter belongs to a genre of resistance literature, texts composed within colonized or dominated communities that express, in prophetic form, the hope of eventual liberation. Similar texts appear across the ancient world, in Jewish apocalyptic literature under foreign domination, in Egyptian demotic texts, in Persian texts under the Seleucids. Prophecy as resistance. The future as a place where justice returns. The oracle kept being copied and updated across centuries. Each new community that read it found in it a description of their present and a promise about their future. Across multiple ancient and medieval prophetic traditions, Jewish apocalyptic texts, the Book of Revelation, Sibylline oracles, Zoroastrian end-time texts, Norse Ragnarok, there is a consistent image. The end of the age will be announced or accompanied by fire from the sky. Stars will fall. The sun will darken. Celestial fire will descend. These images were not pure fantasy. The ancient world experienced genuine celestial events that would have been terrifying to witness without a scientific framework. Meteor showers, fireballs, comets with brilliant tails, large meteorite impacts. The Tunguska event of 1908, an asteroid or comet fragment that exploded over Siberia with the force of roughly 12 megatons, would, if it had struck a populated area in antiquity, have seemed like the end of the world. A hypothesis under ongoing scientific investigation suggests that a cosmic impact event approximately 12,900 years ago triggered a period of rapid cooling, the Younger Dryas, contributing to the extinction of megafauna and the destabilization of early human populations across the northern hemisphere. If this hypothesis is correct, deep human memory of catastrophic fire from the sky, fire that destroyed the world as it was known, may lie behind these prophetic images of celestial destruction. Every culture that has looked at the sky with sustained attention has eventually seen something alarming in it. The question is whether the alarm was a memory of the past, a prediction of the future, or simply the recognition that the universe does not guarantee our safety. Perhaps all three. Merlin. The name conjures wizards, Arthurian courts, owls in towers. The literary Merlin is largely the creation of Geoffrey of Monmouth, a Welsh cleric writing in the 12th century CE whose history of the kings of Britain synthesized Welsh tradition, Latin learning, and considerable imagination into one of the most influential books of the Middle Ages. Geoffrey included an extended series of prophecies attributed to Merlin, dense, symbolic, often baffling predictions about the future of Britain. Lions, dragons, eagles, and serpents appear throughout, engaged in cosmic struggles that were understood by medieval readers as descriptions of real political events past, present, and future. Medieval readers were skilled and enthusiastic at finding matches between Merlin's symbolic imagery and actual historical events. Norman conquest? There's a symbol for that. The rise of the Plantagenets? Found it. Wars between England and Scotland? Clearly predicted. The prophecies were popular enough that kings and rebels both cited them as justification for their actions. A successful king proved Merlin right. A failed rebellion had clearly misread the symbols. This is prophecy doing its deepest social work, providing a framework within which events become meaningful rather than random. Medieval people did not have access to economic analysis, demographic data, or geopolitical theory. What they had was the sense that history had a shape, that it moved according to a plan, and that the prophetic tradition preserved clues about that plan. Merlin as the keeper of Britain's meaning. The symbol systems change. The need they serve does not. Before Rome arrived in Britain, before Julius Caesar's raids of 55 and 54 BCE, before Claudius's actual conquest in 43 CE, there was a priestly and intellectual class in Celtic Britain known as the Druids. They served as priests, judges, astronomers, poets, and keepers of oral tradition. They practiced divination and were deeply attentive to natural omens. Later medieval tradition, drawing on genuine Celtic symbolic systems, preserved the idea that Druidic prophecy had spoken of great wings descending on Britain from the south, of birds of prey associated with foreign powers, of eagles marking the arrival of conquest. The eagle, of course, was the primary symbol of Rome. The Roman legions carried eagle standards. The eagle was Rome. When Claudius's legions landed in 43 CE and systematically conquered Britain, later British tradition retrospectively described this as the fulfillment of prophecy. The eagles had arrived. The old Druidic warnings had been accurate. The Druids were actively suppressed by the Romans. Their sacred sites were destroyed. The intellectual class was dismantled. Whatever genuine prophetic tradition they maintained was largely lost, surviving only in fragments and in the distorting mirror of Roman and later medieval sources. We cannot know what the Druids actually predicted. We know only what later tradition said they predicted, after the events described had already occurred. The eagles came. Whether anyone truly saw them coming before they arrived, that knowledge is gone, buried under almost 2,000 years of accumulated storytelling. When Alexander the Great marched his army south from Macedonia to deal with a Greek rebellion shortly after becoming king, Thebes, one of the great cities of ancient Greece, home of Epaminondas and the sacred band, cultural center of Boeotia, chose to resist. It was a catastrophic decision. Ancient sources record that there had been prophetic warnings about Thebes, omens, oracular responses, and signs that the city ignored or misinterpreted. A spring reportedly turned blood red. Spiders wove webs across the entrance to a temple. Statues were said to have sweated. The priests interpreted these as warnings of foreign danger that would be repelled. Alexander's generals and propagandists later claimed the signs had been misread. They foretold Thebes' destruction, not its salvation. Alexander destroyed Thebes utterly. The city was razed. Its population, approximately 30,000 people, was killed or enslaved. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. It was a deliberate act of terror, designed to end Greek resistance through the example of what happened to those who resisted. It worked. The oracular tradition around Thebes' fall illustrates one of the persistent problems with prophetic interpretation. The same signs can be read optimistically or pessimistically depending on what the interpreter wants. The signs were the same. The outcomes produced different readers. In 135 BC, a slave revolt broke out in Sicily that would shake the Roman Republic. Its leader was a man named Eunice, a Syrian slave who had belonged to a Greek master in the city of Enna. What distinguished Eunice from other potential rebellion leaders was not physical strength or military experience. It was his claim to divine communication. Eunice was known among his fellow slaves for practicing a form of fire breathing during performances, a trick, but an impressive one, and for claiming that the Syrian goddess Atargatis sent him visions. In these visions, he reportedly described a future in which he would be king. His fellow slaves believed him. Or at least they chose to follow a man who believed himself destined for kingship over one who did not. The First Servile War lasted from 135 to 132 BCE. At its height, the rebels controlled much of the interior of Sicily. Eunice was crowned king, took the name Antiochus, a royal name, and governed what was briefly a functioning rebel state. He minted coins. He held court. He was a king. Roman armies eventually suppressed the revolt. Eunice died in prison, reportedly of illness, before he could be executed. His dream of kingship lasted roughly 3 years. Eunice's claim of divine prophetic visions was not unique in the ancient world. Many leaders used religious authority to organize followers. What is striking is that his prophecy, absurd as it seemed when he was a slave, was literally fulfilled. He became king. For 3 years, on the island of Sicily, a man who had claimed prophetic vision of his own kingship was, in fact, a king. The prophecy was not wrong. It was just temporary. In the centuries following the Spanish conquest of the Americas, European and eventually indigenous authored accounts began to record a claim that would become widely repeated, that Aztec and other Mesoamerican traditions had included prophecies about pale-skinned, bearded men arriving from the east across the sea, and that Hernan Cortés and his conquistadors were mistaken for the returning god Quetzalcoatl, facilitating the conquest. Modern historians of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica have largely challenged this narrative. The primary sources for the Quetzalcoatl-Cortés identification are almost entirely post-conquest documents, written after the Spanish had already established dominance, often by indigenous informants working within Spanish colonial frameworks, or by Spanish writers who had obvious reasons to present the conquest as divinely ordained or inevitable. Pre-conquest Aztec sources do not clearly support the idea that Quetzalcoatl was expected to return as a bearded man from the sea in 1519. What the documentary record does show is that the Aztec response to the Spanish was complex, pragmatic, and politically sophisticated, not the passive acceptance of a prophecy being fulfilled. Moctezuma too sent emissaries, gathered intelligence, tried multiple diplomatic strategies, and made military decisions. The claim that he believed Cortés was a returning god may be a simplification that served colonial narratives of inevitable conquest. Nevertheless, the story became one of the most widely known narratives of the colonial period. Whether or not there was a genuine prophetic tradition that predicted bearded men from the sea, the story of that prophecy shaped how both conquerors and conquered understood what had happened. A narrative about prophecy can be as powerful as a prophecy itself. In Andean cosmology, Viracocha was a creator deity, a figure who had made the world and the first people, who had walked among humans teaching civilization, and who had eventually departed, walking into the Pacific Ocean or disappearing over the horizon, promising to return. Francisco Pizarro landed on the coast of Peru in 1532 with approximately 170 men. Within 2 years, he had captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, received a room full of gold and silver as ransom, and then executed Atahualpa anyway. The Inca Empire, which had controlled the largest territory in pre-Columbian American history, collapsed. Similar to the Quetzalcoatl narrative in Mexico, later accounts suggested that the Inca had interpreted the Spanish as Viracochas, divine beings, perhaps connected to the creator deity, and that this identification had contributed to the Incas' initial hesitation to resist. The same scholarly caution applies. The sources for these claims are overwhelmingly post-conquest. The Inca Empire had just emerged from a devastating civil war, and the state was politically fractured in ways that helped the Spanish far more than any misidentification of Pizarro as a deity. What gets lost in the prophecy narrative is the sophistication of the people who were conquered. The Inca were extraordinary engineers, administrators, astronomers, and diplomats. They built an empire across the spine of the Andes. They made roads. They moved mountains. They were not defeated because they thought Pizarro was a god. They were defeated by horses, steel, disease, and the catastrophic bad luck of timing. Among multiple Native American prophetic traditions, particularly from the Plains and Great Basin cultures, there are accounts preserved in oral tradition and later recorded by anthropologists of visions in which a great iron serpent or snake moved across the land, breathing fire and smoke, carrying people at impossible speeds, cutting the earth in straight lines regardless of terrain. The Iron Horse. The Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. The construction and expansion of the American railway network across the 19th century dramatically and catastrophically transformed the North American continent. It enabled mass settlement of the Great Plains. It contributed directly to the near extinction of the bison, the central resource of Plains indigenous cultures, as commercial hunters rode trains to the killing grounds. The railroad was, for indigenous peoples of the interior, a literally world-ending development. How old the prophetic visions of the Iron Snake are is genuinely uncertain. Some may predate European contact. Some may have developed as rumors of Eastern railroads spread westward before the physical reality arrived. Some may be retrospective, visions that acquired the detail of iron snakes only after iron horses had become real. What strikes me about this prophecy, regardless of its chronological relationship to the events, is the aptness of the metaphor. An iron snake. Cold, mechanical, relentless, cutting through the landscape on its own path with no regard for what was there before. Whoever chose that image, before or after the reality, chose well. The Hopi people of the American Southwest have maintained one of the most sustained and coherent prophetic traditions in indigenous North American culture. Their cosmological framework includes a series of worlds, the current world being the fourth, and a detailed understanding of signs that mark the approach of major transitions. Among the prophecies attributed to Hopi tradition is a description of a gourd of ashes that, when dropped from the sky, will boil the oceans, burn the land, and create long-lasting destruction. In the 20th century, particularly following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 and the atmospheric nuclear tests of the 1950s, some Hopi elders and scholars of Hopi tradition identified the atomic bomb as the prophesied gourd of ashes. A weapon dropped from the sky. An explosion that boils and burns. Lasting contamination of land and water. The age of the specific gourd of ashes language in Hopi prophetic tradition is difficult to establish with certainty. But within the Hopi community, elders who spoke to the United Nations in 1992 presented these prophecies as ancient and genuine, part of an unbroken oral tradition. Even if the language emerged after Hiroshima as a way of making sense of an almost unimaginable event, that is still prophecy doing its work. Finding meaning. Placing the unbearable inside a frame that gives it shape and connects it to larger patterns of consequence and choice. The gourd of ashes. A phrase for the thing that, once used, cannot be taken back. Plato, in two dialogues written around 360 BC, Timaeus and Critias, describes a remarkable island civilization. Atlantis, a naval empire of extraordinary power and sophistication, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. It had conquered much of Europe and Africa before the Athenians heroically repelled its assault. And then, in a single day and night, Atlantis sank beneath the waves. Atlantis is usually discussed as legend or myth rather than prophecy. but Plato presents it specifically as an ancient story, preserved in Egyptian priestly records, that contained a warning about hubris, about what happens to great civilizations when they become corrupt and overreach. In this sense, Atlantis is a prophetic narrative, not a prediction of the future but a warning encoded in a story about the past. The shape of what will happen to any civilization that follows the Atlantean path. The most plausible candidates for a real event behind the myth are the catastrophic volcanic eruption of Tyre, modern Santorini, around 1600 BCE, which destroyed the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete, and various coastal flooding events associated with rising sea levels after the last ice age. Whether or not Atlantis was real, Plato created something with extraordinary prophetic staying power. Every subsequent era has found in the Atlantis story a mirror for its own anxieties about civilization and its fragility. A great power that grew too confident and was swallowed by the sea. The sea is still there. The confidence of civilizations has not notably diminished. In 1726, Jonathan Swift published Gulliver's Travels, a satirical novel that remains one of the great works of English literature. In the third voyage, Gulliver visits the flying island of Laputa, home to distracted scientists and mathematicians who study the sky obsessively. Swift, mocking the astronomical enthusiasms of his era, casually included a detail about Martian astronomy. The Laputans, he wrote, had discovered two small moons orbiting Mars. They moved quickly in their orbits, the inner moon completing a circuit in 10 hours, the outer in 21.5. In August 1877, the American astronomer Asaph Hall discovered two moons of Mars using the then 26-inch refractor telescope at the United States Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. He named them Phobos and Deimos, fear and panic, after the attendants of the god of war. Phobos orbits Mars in approximately 7.5 hours. Deimos orbits in just over 30 hours. Swift had imagined two moons. There were two moons. He had guessed at orbital periods. His guesses were in the right order of magnitude. The most likely explanation is that Swift was doing extrapolation rather than prophecy. Astronomers of his era had identified moons around Jupiter and Saturn, and it seemed logical that the planets between Earth and the outer system might also have moons. If Earth had one and Jupiter had four, Mars, between them, might have two. Swift was making a probabilistic guess, dressed in satirical clothing. Even so, two moons. 151 years before their discovery. Written in a novel about imaginary scientists on a flying island. Sometimes a good guess is indistinguishable from a vision. The Sibylline tradition evolved significantly over the centuries. By the time of the late Republic and early Empire, Sibylline prophecy had become a comprehensive cultural framework for Roman dominance. The oracles spoke, in various preserved fragments and references, of Rome's destiny to rule the Mediterranean world and beyond. Here is something worth considering slowly. If you are a Roman general or politician who genuinely believes that Rome is divinely destined to rule the world, that the gods themselves have ordained this, how does that belief affect your behavior? You fight harder. You accept higher casualties. You persist when rational calculation might say to stop. You interpret defeats as temporary setbacks rather than signals to abandon the project. You invest in building permanent infrastructure in conquered territories because you intend to stay permanently. A prophecy of world dominance, genuinely believed, is a strategic asset. Rome did not, in the end, rule the world. The limits of Roman imperial power were very real. The Rhine, the Danube, Hadrian's Wall, the Parthian border. The dream of total world dominance remained a dream. And yet Rome lasted, in its eastern form, until 1453 CE. From the traditional founding in 753 BCE to the fall of Constantinople is over 2,000 years of something calling itself Rome. If you aimed for the world and got 2,000 years, the prophecy was not entirely wrong. For generations of Romans, Carthage was the existential threat. The Punic Wars, 3 of them, spanning over a century, shaped Roman identity in ways that went deep into their mythology and their nightmares. Roman children were reportedly frightened into good behavior with the threat of Hannibal. Hannibal at the gates was the ancient equivalent of the monster under the bed, except real and recently historical. Ancient Roman writers described the Sibylline books being consulted multiple times during the Second Punic War, during Hannibal's Italian campaign, after Cannae, in moments of maximum crisis. Each consultation reinforced the sense that Rome's struggle had cosmic significance, that the gods were present in the outcome, that the Republic's survival was part of a larger divine plan. Hannibal was eventually recalled to Africa. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC ended the Second Punic War decisively in Rome's favor. And in 146 BC, Rome destroyed Carthage completely, ending the Carthaginian civilization. Cato the Elder, 4 years before Carthage's final destruction, ended every speech in the Roman Senate, regardless of topic, with the same phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." It was. And Rome's prophetically reinforced sense of destiny was, in this case, historically vindicated. Victory writes the Prophecies. We return one more time to the wooden wall, the fleet, and the Battle of Salamis. But let us look at it from a different angle, not as a question of prophetic accuracy but as a question of how prophecy functioned in the decision-making of an entire city. The evacuation of Athens was unprecedented. An entire city, tens of thousands of people, loading onto boats and leaving. The Acropolis abandoned. The temples left undefended. The homes, the workshops, the records, the accumulated property of generations. This would not have happened without the oracle. Not because Athenians were credulous, but because the oracle provided a shared narrative that made the terrible thing collectively acceptable. If we leave, the oracle says the wooden wall will save us. We are not running away. We are following divine instruction. Themistocles needed the oracle to be able to implement his strategy. The oracle needed a Themistocles to be correctly interpreted. Oracular pronouncement functioned, in the ancient Greek world, as a kind of social technology, a mechanism for making collective decisions in situations where the normal processes of deliberation were insufficient. When the stakes were too high, when the disagreement was too sharp, when the required action was too frightening, you consulted the oracle. The oracle did not make the decision. Themistocles made the decision. But the oracle made the decision socially possible. We no longer have the oracle at Delphi. We have other mechanisms for making frightening collective decisions, democratic votes, expert consensus, emergency powers legislation. They work differently. They fail differently. Whether they work better is a question for which history is still accumulating evidence. We return one more time to Alexander's siege of Tyre, because it deserves a moment of pure appreciation as an act of human determination. Tyre sits on its island, 800 meters from the mainland, protected by walls that rose to over 40 meters on the landward side. The Tyrians have just watched Alexander conquer everything else within reach. They know they are next. They are well supplied and have a formidable navy. And Alexander, who does not have a navy adequate to the task, decides to build a road to the island. His engineers began driving stakes into the sea floor and filling in the space between them with rubble. The rubble came from the ruins of the old mainland city that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed 2 centuries earlier. Alexander's workers scraped the surface of the old city bare, its stones, its timber, its very topsoil, and threw them into the sea. The Tyrians, watching from their walls, reportedly mocked the project initially. An army trying to build a road across the sea. The causeway reached the island. Combined with a Cypriot and Phoenician fleet that Alexander had since acquired, the siege succeeded. Tyre fell in 332 BCE. Alexander was characteristically brutal in response to the resistance, crucifying 2,000 Tyrian soldiers along the shore. And they shall lay thy stones and thy timber and thy dust in the midst of the water. Written, by scholarly consensus, in the 6th century BCE. Fulfilled, depending on your reading, by Alexander in the 4th. Whether prophecy, or coincidence, or the logical consequence of a besieged island city's physical geography eventually presenting the same engineering solution to any sufficiently determined besieger, the words fit the event. The fit is exact enough to make you pause. And pausing, sometimes, is enough. Across these 50 stories, across 6,000 years of human history and dozens of civilizations, we have encountered the same recurring mystery in different costumes. A person, or a tradition, or a text says, "This will happen." And then it does. Or something close enough to it happens that people say, "Yes, that's what was meant." The question we cannot definitively answer is, which comes first? The first possibility is genuine foreknowledge, that some humans, in some conditions, using some faculties we do not yet fully understand, have access to information about future events that should not be accessible to them. This is the traditional religious understanding of prophecy. It requires the least comfortable assumptions for a scientific worldview. The second possibility is pattern recognition, that the most gifted prophets were, in fact, the most acute observers of present reality. Jeremiah read the geopolitical situation accurately. Themistocles understood military strategy. Josephus understood Roman politics. They expressed their assessments in prophetic language because that was the idiom available to them and the format their audiences trusted. The prophecy was essentially correct political or strategic analysis. The third possibility is retrospective selection, that the prophecies which seemed to match events were preserved, and those which did not were discarded or quietly forgotten. We are reading a curated collection, filtered through centuries of people who had reasons to emphasize certain texts and ignore others. The archive of fulfilled prophecy is not random, it is the result of many hands deciding what to remember. What is most likely true is that all three mechanisms operated simultaneously, at different moments, in different traditions, in different proportions. Some prophecies were genuine insights. Some were political analysis in religious clothing. Most of what we have survived because it matched events closely enough that generations of readers found it meaningful. But there is a deeper question underneath all of this, and it is the one that really matters as you drift toward sleep. Does prophecy shape history, or does history reshape prophecy? Themistocles built the fleet because he believed it was strategically necessary. He then found an oracle that confirmed his interpretation. Did the oracle shape his decision, or did his decision shape how he read the oracle? Cyrus the Great knew, through Persian diplomatic intelligence, that there was a Jewish prophetic tradition that named him as a liberator. His edict allowing the Jews to return home was good politics and good intelligence. But it may also have been genuine, a man who heard that an ancient text had called him by name and felt something about that. The causeway to Tyre was the only viable engineering solution to the problem Alexander faced. Ezekiel's words about throwing Tyre stones into the sea did not cause Alexander to build the causeway. But when Alexander's engineers threw those stones into the water, someone who knew Ezekiel's text must have felt the hair on their arms stand up. What the ancient world understood that our own skeptical era sometimes forgets is that meaning is not the same as mechanism. A thing can have a natural explanation and also be significant. A coincidence can be real and also worth noticing. A prediction can be partially wrong in its details and entirely right in its spirit. The oracle said wood. Themistocles said ships. Both were right. 50 stories. A solar eclipse stopping a war. An oracle naming a lamb and a tortoise. A slave who became a king. A poet who imagined 2 moons. A causeway built from a ruined city, thrown into the sea. These are human stories, which means they are stories about the need to make sense of things, to find the pattern in the chaos, to see the face in the clouds, to believe that the universe is not merely indifferent to us but is somehow, in some way we cannot quite articulate, paying attention. It is late now, or early. The hour is uncertain. Outside, if there is an outside where you are, the stars are doing what they have always done. Moving in patterns that can be calculated, predicted, mapped. The same patterns that the Assyrian scribes watched from their ziggurats. That Pythagoras described in numbers. That Thales used to predict the eclipse that stopped a battle. The sky still moves. We still watch it. We still wonder if it means something. Perhaps it does. Perhaps wonder is the answer, not certainty in either direction, but the willingness to be astonished by the strangeness of time. By the fact that words written in Babylon in the 6th century BCE are being read now, in this moment, wherever you are. By the fact that an eclipse moved 2 armies to peace. By the fact that a general named his prediction, and the world named him back. Let the strangeness settle. Let the ancient voices do what they have always done, whisper across the distance. Sleep well. The stars are keeping their old appointments.